Something terrible came with the rain. Part 4. I expected Alyssa's mood to change drastically after leaving Harry behind, but she was as focused on surviving now as she was prior to that. The streets were way emptier now than they were when I first ran outside of my house. We walked in the middle of the road to avoid getting jumped from the corner, even though we knew it was equally risky exposing ourselves like that. Whenever we heard an inhuman sound from the distance, Alyssa made us stop until we were sure we weren't in danger. Walking in the rain gave us some cover, which allowed us to move relatively faster, but we still had to be careful. "Wait," I whispered to Alyssa, pointing down the street. "See that?" There was a little girl a few hundred yards away from us, standing in the middle of the road, facing away from us. My initial instinct was to go see if she was okay, but based on everything I'd seen by that point, I knew there was a high probability that this wasn't a little girl in distress at all. I was right, because as soon as Alyssa saw her, she cursed under her breath and pulled me aside behind a bush. "What's wrong?" "Whatever you see there, that's not a little girl." Alyssa peeked behind the bush where we hid. "Saw her, or someone resembling her, a bit earlier. She stood exactly like that, and when a guy approached to help, during the chaos, she turned around and she had no fucking eyes or nose. Instead, her entire face was replaced by a big fucking vertical line for a mouth, with sharp fucking teeth. The poor guy never stood a chance. So what do we do?" "Let's try a different street," she suggested. We sneaked through a backyard, ignoring the dead bodies along the way, and went through the adjacent street. Halfway through, I heard a pained groan coming from the dark alley to my left. I readied my hatchet, while Alyssa readied her gun. A creature crawled out into the light, barely able to pull its own weight with what was left of its human-looking arm. The thing looked like a swollen blob in its shape, barely recognizable where the head was, which I could only tell from the eye visible under the heavily swollen blisters. Some of the blisters looked volatile, pulsating under the streetlight, looking like they would pop at the slightest touch. I tried not to think about whether it used to be human, as it pathetically dragged itself towards us, groaning through the small slit of a mouth, the one visible eye wide open and darting from Alyssa to me intermittently. "Leave it," Alyssa said. "It's harmless unless it manages to grab you. I've seen one earlier." She holstered her gun and urged me to follow her. I gave the amalgamation of the creature one last glance before following my partner. "What exactly have you seen, Alyssa?" I asked while walking behind her. She was silent for a moment before responding. "I got caught in a downpour while heading home. It was like a war zone, military killing everything. Monsters of all shapes and sizes killing everything, and civilians just trying to escape. I didn't stick around to find out, since their heavy rain brought some really bad monsters." "Wait, look!" I pointed to a graffiti on a billboard. It said, 36 will save us. "You mentioned it before, right? What is it?" "I don't know. I heard the military talking about it over the radio. Whoever or whatever it is, it's responsible for all the crazy shit happening in town." We walked in silence for the rest of the way until we reached the hospital. It's a good thing too, because the rain started to get heavier by the time we reached the entrance. There were no monsters in front, but when we entered, our hearts dropped at the amount of dead bodies in front of the desk, both human and otherwise. "Shit." Alyssa cursed quietly and readied her gun. This was a bad idea. We should get out of here. As if a higher force heard me, it started raining cats and dogs again, so going outside at this point was impossible. "Let's proceed carefully. Maybe they barricaded themselves somewhere upstairs." We got past the reception, carefully stepping around the dead bodies. The hospital wasn't big, so we figured we'd check it out quickly enough. The elevator was completely demolished, so that was out of the question. Really though, it looked as if a truck drove into it, bending the door inward all the way to the backside. We climbed the stairs to the second floor, and as soon as we did, the air became heavy. It's hard to explain, but it was as if someone had been keeping all the windows shut for a long time, making the room stuffy. There were no dead bodies, but the place was chaotic. Stretchers and trash bins knocked over, etc. "Let's split up and check each side separately," Alyssa said when we reached the end of the corridor. "I'll check the patient rooms on this side. You check that one. Let's meet up here once we're all done, and if you see anything, scream." I wasn't exactly happy at the thought of roaming this place alone, but I hesitantly nodded and we split up. All the other rooms were empty, just like the rest of the floor. It didn't make sense, but the only possible outcome was that the survivors probably barricaded themselves on the 3rd floor. I came back to the meeting point, and then I heard Alyssa calling me from around the corner. "Hey, come check this out," she said from one of the rooms. "Coming," I said, and followed her voice. Just when I was about to open the door, I felt a firm grip on my left hand. I jerked my head in that direction and saw Alyssa holding my wrist, shaking her head with a worried look on her face. "Don't, that's not me," she whispered with a trembling voice. My mind couldn't process what I was looking at. I stared at her and then back at the door. "Hey, you still there?" Alyssa's voice came from the room again, followed by an approaching set of footsteps. "Come on!" The Alyssa, still holding onto my wrist, pulled me into one of the adjacent rooms, where we quickly hid inside the locker. "Quiet now," she whispered. A second later, the door opened, and through the cracks, I saw Alyssa walking in and looking around. "Damn it, where'd he go?" she mumbled and turned around to leave the room. Just then, I felt the grip on my wrist tighten even more. I looked down in the dark and saw the hand holding it. But it wasn't Alyssa's hand. The fingers which held me were bony and elongated. I looked to my left and saw not Alyssa, but a bald old man who looked like his life was way overdue by 100 years. I felt my blood run cold, and when I tried screaming, I was unable to do so. So instead, I burst through the locker, falling on my shoulder painfully. I got up and ran outside just in time to see Alyssa pointing her gun at me. "Run!" I shouted and saw her looking over my shoulder before she bolted out of the room with me. We ran to the stairs and up on the 3rd floor, making our way past the dozens of bodies of patients, staff members, monsters, etc. A realization raced through my mind that there were no survivors, and as we reached a dead end, blocked by a makeshift barricade, we turned around to see if the old man followed us. A second later, he climbed the stairs, striding menacingly towards us. At this point, the lights started flickering, and every time they would go off and come back on, the man was much closer. Alyssa started shooting, but it was as if every time she fired a bullet, the lights would go out for a split second and the man would appear in a different spot. Always a step closer. And then he finally reached us. But instead of attacking us, he simply went past us. We followed him with our gaze and the lights went out again. But this time, they didn't come back on. There were sounds of loud crashing and objects being thrown, at some moments right next to me. When the lights finally did come back on, after almost a whole minute, the barricade behind us was completely ransacked and the way clear. The old man was nowhere to be seen. I looked around at all the dead bodies of monsters around me and inspected the identical tattoos they all had on their wrists, or whatever extensions of extremities they had. The same tattoo I saw on the old man's wrist when he held me in the locker. A simple 2-digit number. 36. This is Kinetic Symphony. If you've enjoyed this narrated story, please subscribe and like the video to help me grow. Thank you.